All right, so this happened a few days ago. It is a conversation between Malcolm Nance. I hope I'm saying that right. You guys are going to call me racist. And Ben Shapiro. It's about critical race theory. Obviously, critical race theory is pumping. It's quite a hot button issue. I've looked into some critical race theory. I think with good intentions, it's a very interesting theory, and it's worth considering and investigating. I mean, if you have the time to. I don't think kids should be learning it. I think that it's very easy to either teach it as like we'll say like, white blaming, or even interpret it learning wise as like white blaming, which is why I think that like 18-year-olds plus is an acceptable age for you to start learning these things, because they're very deep, and you do need to disconnect yourself. When it comes to critical race theory, you need to disconnect yourself from critical race theory, and because you really kind of have to understand that when you're speaking honestly within critical race theory, if you're honestly learning it or teaching it, you have to make it so you have to understand that whiteness in this context is a why the fuck is the word leaving me right now? Whiteness is more of a social construct in these kind of terms. So yeah, let's watch this though. Let's see how the conversation goes. Let's see it.
Let's get
see what's
back
up.
into hard news. I hate it. We're having such a good time, and now we're gonna fight. And now I'm gonna make you fight again. But it's okay. But I got to talk about the muzzle laws. There's these laws that are been introduced in a number of states to not talk about critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, I must say, to begin with, I hadn't heard the term probably a year ago. Now I hear it every day. I think Americans are just starting to hear it, and I think no one knows exactly what it is.
That's
they know
fair.
It has something to do with race, and it's some kind of a theory.
That's true.
Right? How would you describe it? And then,
but before they get into it, it's actually very interesting, because I was talking the other day with Mama Gut, and we were talking about how we were talking about trans issues, and we're talking about that like society's not ready to be fully accepting of trans people, because while a lot of people on the internet are like very involved in trans issues, people in like the real world aren't there yet. They don't understand, and people obviously when they don't understand something, they get like upset and critical. And I think that's a really good point. I've heard about critical race theory about like a year ago. And like, so I have a better understanding of it. It's not as threatening to me. I think, again, the implementation can be a little risque, but most people haven't heard of it, and it's just shooting into like the culture and the media and everything. And I think that that's a reasonable argument to make. It's like people don't know what it is; they're just hearing it, and and you could say like, oh, well, that's just conservatives pushing it in the worst way possible, or maybe that's just a way that like normal people are interpreting it. So.
Then we'll ask, how would you describe? What is critical race theory?
I will admit that I read a lot of critical race theory in law school. So, the work of Derek Bell or Gene Stefanczyk
This is
and
the
Richard
stuff
Delgado.
no one knows but you and 6 other people.
Right. So,
but what matters is what is it practically? It's being taught in schools or some form of.
Yes, there's a certain sort of crystallized version of it that is a lot less complex than what critical race theory actually is. But critical race theory essentially argues that racism is baked into all the systems of American society, and that any sort of neutral system is in fact a guise for racial power. And so the argument is made by Derek Bell, for example, that Brown versus Board of Education, this is an argument he made in 1991, that Brown versus Board of Education was actually a way for the white community to leverage its own power. It wasn't an attempt to end segregation in public schools. Even things that are purportedly good in terms of race, so long as they uphold these broader systems, things like capitalism or things like the meritocracy, these things are actually just guises for power. And so what that boils down to in sort of practical terms is all disparity equals discrimination. If you can see any stat where black people are underperforming white people, this means the system was set up for the benefit of white people, and that white people have a duty to tear down these systems in order to alleviate the racism that's implicit in those systems. When it comes to schools, what this tends to boil down to is kids who are white have experienced privilege because the system was built for white people, and we have to change the standards.
Right. Now, okay, well, so Malcolm, you tell me your definition.
Oh, I agree with everything he just said.
Oh, great.
And I appreciate you being honest in defining of what it's like to be black American, right? That is, I mean, we're talking about a system.
That's not fair.
No, I'm just saying I agree with all of those suppositions because they are grounded in truth. Look, and the funny thing is, it's not just African Americans, right? It's also the The Scalp Act of 1749, where for $300 modern dollars, you had to cut off the head or the hair of an Indian to prove that you've got them out of...
I mean, like, I'm listening and trying to think critically, but I feel like something from 49 probably is that's specifically paying to scalp people. I'm pretty sure, like, we all acknowledge that, like, that's not acceptable. So it's not a good example whatsoever of like anything to do with critical race theory.
The way so they could settle. That's a little bit of American history that people should know about. The Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1840s. These are...
Yeah, like we know those were actively discriminatory, but like that's not what we're having conversations about.
These are things we don't talk about.
That's not, I mean, that's, first of all, that's not... It's not true that people don't talk about these things. We all did learn about...
You don't want them talked about?
No, that's not true either.
You want to cancel them?
No, Malcolm, I'm sorry, you're lying. That's lying.
But who the fuck... I'm very... he's giving history as a prequel to the argument, but then, like, it's not really relevant, right? So when we talk about critical race theory and, like, different types of oppression... What we're more focusing on are laws that are created that don't specifically actively target somebody in like that capacity, but would have the negative impact of disproportionately attacking somebody. That's kind of more where it comes from. And so bringing up things from like that's fine. Like, yeah, we used to have horrible laws in our country, and like a lot of countries have horrible laws as well. Like, it's okay to stone gay people to death. Like, that's terrible. That's active oppression. But we're trying to talk about something a bit more subtle, which is like the invasion of racism within our system. This doesn't really show any nuanced take of like invasion of racism within our system.
That's just that it is lying. I've personally talked about many of the things that you just mentioned. I define critical race theory by citing the actual authors of critical race theory, and you seem to be a pretty good beneficiary of the meritocracy because you have merit, Malcolm. So if you're going to criticize the meritocracy as an outgrowth of white supremacy, then you're going to have to tear down the system that you've succeeded in because you have merit, or do not have merit.
You know, when my great-great-grandfather ran away from slavery to join the 111th U.S. Colored Troops and fight against the South, keeping human beings as slaves, he didn't think, you know what, in 150 years, my great-great-grandson's going to have to sit on stage and argue with a guy who thinks all that's bullshit. All right?
Yeah, it's just kind of like I think that there's merit to critical race theory. I just don't think that this guy's really bringing a lot of merit to critical race theory, because we haven't talked about, like, here... So, like, okay, CRT covers a lot of things, but if I was going to look at a law that was like a systemically like oppressive law, for instance, I would look at like voter ID type of laws, right? Laws that are actively targeting particular groups of people to stop them from voting, right? And so, like, a lot of these laws happen in like southern states where the poor people are more disproportionately black, and so they're saying like, hey, we want people to vote Republican. Let's implement laws that will restrict people who generally vote Democrat from being able to vote, such as like, oh, you can't vote on Sundays. Well, in these poor areas, they don't have a lot of voting areas and they don't have a lot of transportation. So on Sunday, they get into their church buses and then they'll go to vote, right? Oh, you can't hand out water and whatnot on lines, okay, or food on lines. Well, the reason why that actively targets a particular group of people, which usually is poor people, but they're disproportionately black in these poor black areas. It's like, well, like we said, the lines are long because there's not a whole lot of places to vote. Or when they try to make it so instead of being able to vote from 7 to 7, they do 9 to 5 where people are working so they can't get out to vote, plus the Sunday. So you understand what I'm saying? That's kind of where you look into. It's like, okay, laws that don't specifically target black people, but have the negative impact of disproportionately targeting black people. That's where you would have like a conversation around like critical race theory or different forms of oppression or ways that like whiteness has intruded the system to oppress black people, right? Because usually it's white people voting on these things to stop really Democrats from voting, but it's like white Republicans wanting to stop black Democrats from being able to vote because they want to win, not necessarily because they're racist, though it is rather racist to not give a shit about black people's right to vote. But do you understand what I'm saying? Even if you disagree with me, you could go like, okay, I understand where you're coming from, and so we can have a conversation from here. But so far, we're talking about active, objective, proofs of racism that we all acknowledge are absolutely racist and deplorable. And so like we're not having like an honest conversation. We're just emotionally invoking. And the problem is that I would like to see a really good conversation about critical race theory, because I do lean more conservative when it comes to CRT, because while I think it's interesting, I don't understand it. This person isn't doing a good job of explaining it. And I think that they're actually doing a horrible job so far, and we're like we're almost halfway into the video, and that's going to make Ben Shapiro look good, and like that's not necessarily a good thing, you know?
I'm just saying, there is no controversy. The controversy that's made up is people saying that this is being discussed, this is being taught in schools, and that kids should be kept away from it.
That's not true.
It's not even a real controversy.
Malcolm, the 5th largest school district in America, Clark County, just decided that they were going to lower standards with regard to testing because they wanted to alleviate disparities in outcomes. That is an outgrowth of critical race theory.
Can you draw a straight line to it?
Yes.
That's a fair point, actually. So, like, I didn't know this was true, but, like, we do have the... Okay, this is one of the biggest problems when we talk about systemic oppression. I think we do a dishonesty about it. So we look at disparities between, let's just say, white and black people. For obviously, we have a white and black person. Black people underperform when it comes to, like... Black people underperform compared to white people because black people historically haven't had the same access to opportunities. And it's created a very toxic, progressive strand. There's tons of things that go into systemic oppression, right? Like slavery, redlining, segregation, honestly, are the way that we do welfare that doesn't help people as much as it should. We need to reform our welfare system. We need to reform our prison system. There's so many different things that end up happening where black people are disproportionately targeted. But lowering standards rather than raising quality and raising education standards for like giving black people more resources, that's not a positive thing. And so we're taking the easy way out saying standardized testing is racist, which is something that you hear, when the reality is black people just haven't had the same opportunity of education. And you notice how like that's toxic because you really think about that. You have we live in a society where black people have a historical systemic oppression has drastically negatively impacted them. And we say, okay, how do we solve this? And what you say is let's lower the standards to make black people be able to compete rather than to raise the standard of education for black people. Do you see how like that will be another form of systemic oppression, is lowering standards? Because if you're not getting the same education, you don't have the same education standards, you're not going to be educated as well, and you're not going to be any more prepared for the workforce. So, like, I would say that in and of itself would be some form of systemic oppression, pandering to other white people who are offended for black people, and implementing a law based on outcomes rather than trying to promote the outcome being better, to just lower the bar for what the outcome should be.
100%, because when you say that the meritocracy is an outgrowth of white supremacy, and then you suggest that I'm somehow denying that slavery took place, or that your great-great-great-grandfather was...
He quite literally did say that.
Because I'm saying
well, not literally, but he did suggest that.
When they are in school to see if they are good at school, then what you're purporting to push now is just nonsense. And it's sheer bullshit, Malcolm. It's just bullshit.
No, but I think it's also a leap to say that he thought that was bullshit. Because that's not what it is. I mean, are we talking about 2021? Or are we talking about 1861? Because
the point is, can we talk about 1861 and 2021?
Yes, we can. And
you just did.
I don't know who's against talking about history.
We can. It's like we don't embrace those policies now. So it's good to talk. It's good to talk about in the framing that we should acknowledge that we aren't a perfect country, because that's been a narrative that we were pushing, I guess, even from when I was younger, that we were like this perfect country. But it doesn't really, it's not like a conversation about our bad systems. It's a conversation about how bad we used to be.
Well, I mean, I understand that they want to, in Texas, they're talking about removing references to the Ku Klux Klan. They're talking about removing, well, I mean, come on.
That's Texas.
I mean, how can you watch Forrest Gump without even knowing who Nathan Bedford Forrest is, right? I mean, these are people who are historical figures who did...
Are they removing, like, the KKK? Is that a good thing that they would remove mentioning the KKK? Because the KKK is a deplorable scumfuck, I would say, terrorist organization.
Bad things. No one is actually saying we want to go back and erase everything and restart and talk to you about these things. Critical race theory is a subject because the Republican right has made it a subject. No real school organizations are mandating this for kids.
I hope every Democrat in America takes your perspective, and they will be shellacked at the polls. Roy Teixeira just wrote a piece, the emerging Democrat majority, Roy Teixeira, he just wrote a piece about what he called the Fox News fallacy, a tendency of people on the left to believe that just because Fox News mentions something, it can't be real. The reality is...
Well, I mean, that's a Fox News fault. Like, if I don't blame anybody, progressives specifically, for like denying something exists because Fox News talks about it. I mean, like, Fox News is really, like, I think Fox News is the absolute worst when it comes to, like, performative news, entertainment news, absolute worst. Although I do think that they're the best when it comes to actual news, like Brett Barr, Christopher Wallace. I think that they're great. But like, so I could totally. Like we can't just be like, we can't just roll past that. Like, you can't just be like, yeah, I know Fox News is like the bottom of the barrel for entertainment news, but like, you're an idiot for listening to that. Well, there are people who listen to Fox News and think that, like, or listen to the entertainment portion of Fox News portion and think that's real news. So they think that's real news. So you can't criticize the left for being a bit reactionary and being like this is probably a lie, because a lot of times it is, or it's a large misconception. And you can't just be like, yeah, Fox News doesn't have any blame to take. They have a tremendous amount of it. Look, Tucker Carlson seems like a nice guy. Moron, honestly.
A lot of this stuff is taught in schools.
You mean like viruses?
Well, okay.
Now he's just trolling.
Can I?
Now I'm just.
I don't know.
Now I'm just confused.
Can I just,
what you're talking
as far
about?
as
I read something on Twitter where I think this guy was claiming that like there's something to do. People were claiming that like bench, like it was all a propaganda machine on Twitter to say that Ben Shapiro won this debate over this guy as some form of new racism. But really what it is this guy is just been morbidly unintelligent in this conversation. Like, it's not like a third grader could have been like, you know what I mean? Like, he's digging himself a hole.
what people are experiencing in their lives, in their schools.
Yeah.
Okay, you're right. There are states like from the old Confederacy, I think, who do want to airbrush history. That's not
Okay, is that what they're talking about? Airbrushing history? Okay, I thought that we're talking about like removing mentions of the KKK in like a positive context, but obviously they meant it from a historical. Like, we should teach that the KKK is effectively. Well, I learned that the KKK was basically a terrorist organization. We should be learning that.
I think the majority in this country. If you ask me critical race theory, if you say, does that mean teach history unvarnished? I would say yes. Then I'm totally for critical race theory.
Yeah,
if you
that
say,
sounds good.
does it mean acknowledging that racism persists today? I would say yes, teach that. Should we have remedial means? That's like affirmative action. There's lots of people who are against that. I'm still for that. I still think when you read the statistics, and I have some of them here, blacks earn 40%.
In Texas, you can no longer say that the Triple K is morally wrong. Is that true? If that's true, that's fucking crazy. Oh, wait, hold on. So Texas Senate passes bill that removes requirements that teach QKK as morally wrong. If this is true, no, the KKK is morally wrong. The historical documents related to the civic accomplishments of marginalized people be taught in total school international. Among those examples listed, the few is also required teaching of company United States farm workers. Yeah. So like, if the reaction to teaching critical race theory is to effectively platform the KKK to make it seem like it's not so bad, then you're dumb. So, to my understanding, Texas teachers can pick and choose what they want to teach about. That's dumb. Like, KKK is horrible. They're fucking horrible. That's worrisome. Like, that's worrisome.
Less. 90% less family wealth. High poverty high schools, 72% blacks to 31% white. Live 6 years shorter. Half as likely to go to college. 8 times more incarcerated. These are real statistics. The question is, what do we do to address them?
You guys know what I'm going to say. We need to expand wealth through a universal basic income. A lot of our issues, the majority of them come from like a disparity of wealth in like a really negative way. We could like this is something that I'm going to talk about here. People get upset with me when I say this, but I don't think that we should necessarily invest more money into schools. Hear me out for just 1 second. What we need to do is we need to give money to people so that they can decide what's best for it. And I want to explain to you why. People will often say, well, going to school means that you're going to have the outcome of a good job. Not necessarily, right? You're only going to have the outcome of a good job if you go to school like for a job that you're required. But not everybody is on the same trajectory. People that don't have the same access to just like K through 12 opportunity aren't going to succeed as well in college and be able to get the jobs that are desirable in college. So what we need to do is we need to give people the ability to go on the right path. So what you do is this. You give money to community. I'm a UBI guy, $1,000 a month. You could disagree, but the fundamentals are there. Taking that money incentivize small businesses. It makes it so you don't have to raise the minimum wage. So this way people can still get a livable wage without like stressing out businesses. It's a great way to put money into the area, which will bring more jobs and businesses to the area. Because if there's like $1 million a month going into a community, you're going to see grocery stores come over and be like, we want to get some of that money. Well, guess what? That solves the problem of like food deserts where there's not a lot of availability of nutritious food. So you're going to see the communities be revitalized. Jobs will come to the area. You're going to see like the communities grow healthier and healthier. And then you'll have more money to invest for the community in the way that they decide. So they might decide that we should put more money of our taxes into schools. That's the way that I go. Ground floor build up rather than dealing with everything specifically. Because you know what? Some people don't need college. Some people just need gainful employment so that they can help their kids get to college, help their kids get a better education. It's the difference. It could be like if you have a couple that they're not particularly literate, but they are able to work a job and make money and have a family. Now they get to put their kids through school so their kids are literate. Look at people coming from like immigrants coming here who could barely speak English, but their kids speak English fluently and go to college and they're incredibly intelligent. We're not going through the right chain. And so like I'm more of a ground up, provide fundamental wealth and opportunity and let everything else fall into place based on the citizens in those areas deciding what they feel is best for the people in their area, right? Because maybe there's areas where it's like, maybe we shouldn't necessarily invest in schooling, but let's invest a ton of money into trade schools or something. I don't know the issues of a lot of communities. And I think one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest ways that progressive ideology can be ignorantly racist is that they decide to prescribe these like specific solutions for marginalized groups when they don't know a goddamn thing. I don't know anything about any projects. So for me to say we should do this, and this is dumb. But I can say I don't know anything about the projects, so let me advocate for money going into those communities so those communities can do what they feel is the best. And if you say, well, they're uneducated, so they shouldn't have like autonomy over their own money, that's just an ignorant idea because bad decisions fundamentally come from the lack of ability to recover from them, not from actually making them in the first place. If I went out and spent $2,000 on something right now, it's a bad decision, but since I can recover from it, it's not so bad of a decision. You understand my point?
These are real statistics. You think we should address them? You think we should address them?
And for context, somebody asked me, but like my universal basic income would be an opt-in. So like you can't be on the traditional welfare and a UBI at the same time. It's one or the other. And the UBI is better in my opinion because it removes the conditionality of traditional welfare of like you have to be poor to get money because it makes it so that you advocating for that person to not work harder.
Address them, right? The question is, what are we doing about it? Because if
we're not doing anything about
it, making children.
I'm sorry for pausing, but we're not doing anything about it. This is the problem. We talk about CRT, and CRT might be a good thing to talk about, but practical application doesn't help poor black people or poor minorities or poor BIPOC or really just poor people in general. It seems like another like kind of almost performative way for intellectual progressives to like to show their intellectual dominance. I'm not saying it's a bad theory. I'm saying that like when we look at the meat and potatoes of the issue, it's going to be money to poor people. When we want to put a little bit of seasoning on it, that's CRT. It's like it makes the meal taste a little better, but at the end of the day, you need the sustenance more than you need it to taste better. And that's what we're not focusing on.
In school, fixate on race. I'm not for that. If it's about collective guilt, I didn't do anything to your great-great-great-grandfather.
It's true.
I don't want to be responsible for that. If it's about, a toxicity of just from being born white, if it's about dividing everybody into oppressor and oppressed and oppressor, I'm not for that. So there are things that are being taught and are going around that I'm not for, that if that was critical race theory, I wouldn't be for.
I agree with you, and I don't think that's critical race theory.
But it's being,
I think
again,
what's happened here is that
it's so hard because everybody seems to, even in like progressive and conservative spaces, well, actually, everybody in the conservative space has an understanding of what they think it is, and they think that it's basically what Bill Maher said. But then in the progressive space, you have people who are more like logical about it, that are like, hey, this is critical race theory, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, that sounds nice. But then you have other leftists who people who are farther left that are like, oh, it's about white people being the worst. And it's so hard to get a grasp on what it means in the progressive space, because progressives are just so interested in infighting that like we can't come up with the solid like, hey, this is what we mean when we say critical race theory.
Because what's happened here as this terminology, sort of like defund the police, has been hijacked and been framed around the left as that they want to do all this.
But that's the thing. You see people talk about defunding the police, and like first of all, the biggest thing you look at when you say defund the police is like, okay, you're trying to take money away from the police. That's what your literal rhetoric says. Then you investigate it and like, well, we want to take money from the police and we want to invest it into other social programs. Makes sense ideally. But when you practically look into it, you either have really poor police stations that can't afford to reorient funds. They're actually going to need more funds for better training, cameras, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have places like New York that with really strong unions that aren't going to give up money. They cut money from the police, and you know what they did? They cut a program to help homeless people call a service, like the police, and then the police call a service to get them to a shelter. Now they don't do that anymore. And it's wrong. There's probably ways that they could reorient funds, but they're not going to do it. And we need to live in the idealized world. And so if your focus is on better police relations, you can't defund the police. You need to focus on just reforming the police. And we kind of need to look at it from that perspective.
They want to rip down the entire social fabric of America, and they want us to be guilty about everything. I want you to teach history. I had a lot of people in the military. Hold on. I had a lot of people in the military, senior officers who had to make life and death decisions, who were total morons about the cultures and institutions and countries we were going into, and people died because of that.
Wait, what? What? Who cares? Because, well, okay, so what he just said is like you had a bunch of really like you had some like basically war heroes who weren't educated on the Middle East. They weren't educated on the countries they were going into. But you're not advocating for that with critical race theory. What is that? That's like world history. That's a totally different thing. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about anymore. I mean, not that he was really super on the nose with what we were talking about, but now did I hear him right?
Officers who had to make life and death decisions, who were total morons about the cultures and institutions and countries we were going into.
Yeah, why does that matter? Like, why do I? That feels like he probably doesn't know that either. We're talking about America. This is nothing to do with anything. And if you're in a life or death situation, yeah, like how are you supposed to make like hey, we're in a life or death situation, what should we do? I don't know. What would the leftist progressive do? Like, what are you going to make a woke call when you're in the middle of a war zone? None of this makes sense. You couldn't have put a worse opponent up against Ben Shapiro to reflect what critical race theory was.
And people died because of that. Question. I don't need that here.
What, people died because they didn't understand like a particular cultural thing? What was the culture? Stoning gay people? I'm confused. I just don't understand like how it works.
Agree that history should be taught. Why are you defending critical race theory, which is not history?
Did I not just say a moment ago that I think that term has been hijacked and that's not what we're talking about?
Okay, so let's say critical race theory.
I'm going to go back and repeat that.
Well, that's a good point. He's like, oh, that term's been hijacked and it doesn't really exist in that fashion. This is so dumb.
But I didn't say that.
Okay. You are literally defending critical race theory by redefining it as just teaching history, which is a cheap semantic trick, and you know it.
Is this what you do on your show? Because it sucks.
Malcolm, Malcolm.
This is really bad for this guy, Malcolm. He hasn't said anything intelligent the whole time, bro. He's really bad, dude. This guy's a weaselly fuck. And like,
I appreciate that, but I will comfort myself tonight by sleeping on my bed made of money.
I'm sure we have an adult. I'm sure we have another adult subject to talk about.
Well, how about that Andrew Cuomo? I tell you, he's
okay. That was pretty bad. I could see why people on Twitter were saying Ben Shapiro won. It wasn't like the most profound win. It wasn't like he was up against somebody that had a deep understanding of critical race theory. I still don't have a deep understanding of critical race theory. But if I didn't have an understanding of critical race theory and I watched that show, I would be siding with Ben Shapiro instantaneously, rather than being like, right. So most people they're going to watch that and they're going to go like, oh, I don't know what CRT is. What is it? And then you have Malcolm up against Ben, and Malcolm makes no points whatsoever. And then you're going to be like, okay, critical race theory is dumb. So thank you very much, Malcolm Nance, for hurting the progressive ideology by just completely, just being bad. You just hurt the conversation around critical race theory, and you've set people farther right on it. So good for you, my man. Good for you.